This is an exciting time and an important topic as the United States prepares for a biennial national election, and this year, an election for our highest office, President of the United States. We're thrilled to have a talented and experienced panel. First, before we turn to our moderator, Roxana Koktinghar, it is my great pleasure to introduce the Deputy Chief of Mission to the U.S. Embassy here in Dhaka, Bangladesh, Joanne Wagner, a member of our senior foreign service and an experienced diplomat having worked across this region and in Washington. Deputy Chief of Mission Wagner, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum and শুভ সন্ধ্যা আপনাদের মাঝে আসতে পেরে আমি গর্বিত এবং খুবই আনন্দিত. Welcome virtually to the American Center for this very, very timely and interesting discussion about women in political decision making. First, let me acknowledge the COVID-19 pandemic has upended all of our lives, all of our normal lives, and the flooding across much of Bangladesh is causing much additional hardship. My heart goes out to everyone who is suffering because of this. And the United States is continuing to work with the government of Bangladesh to support the COVID-19 response and provide urgently needed humanitarian assistance in the areas impacted by these dreadful floods. But despite these hardships, I am absolutely delighted to be here to celebrate Women's Equality Day, women's participation in the political process, and National Suffrage Month in the United States, as well as the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the amendment that recognized women's right to vote. Tonight, we have an amazing panel, and I am very excited to learn about your views and your experiences. To all of the political activists and civil society advocates and alums of U.S. government exchange programs joining us today, we're so happy you could be here. We need you in this conversation. We need more women in these kinds of conversations. We need more women in diplomacy. We need more women in boardrooms, and we need more women in politics. And we need the men who support these ideas. So we're making progress, but there's a lot of work to do still. But let me begin by looking back just a little bit. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is widely considered to have given women the right to vote. I have a problem with that characterization. For me, the 19th Amendment didn't give women anything they didn't already have. Women have always had the right to vote. But this very, very important amendment recognized women's right to vote and enshrined it in law. And that's a very different thing. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. So in the U.S., beginning in the 1800s, generations of women's rights supporters wrote articles and lectured and marched and lobbied, and they even practiced civil disobedience to achieve what many Americans considered a most radical change in our Constitution. In the summer of 1848, Elizabeth Caddy Stanton, a very courageous woman, she stood at the very first ever Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and declared women should enjoy the most fundamental civil right in our democratic system, and that is the right to vote. And she refused to accept the status quo, and so did thousands of other women. And these women, and again, the men and allies who supported them, they didn't quit. And frankly speaking, thank goodness for that. Because despite concerted efforts to make them give up, they didn't quit. When men said, women don't need to have the right to vote because they'll just vote the way their husbands do, the way their husbands tell them to anyway. Still, these very strong women, they didn't quit. When they were thrown into jail, they didn't quit. In fact, they made going to jail work for them. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony and 50 other women in Rochester, New York, registered to vote in the presidential election. And on election day, she And 14 other women were able to talk the election inspectors into allowing them to cast their ballots. But they were arrested for doing so because this was something illegal. But this act generated a national controversy, and it marked a major step forward for women for the suffrage movement. So when Susan B. Anthony first began campaigning for women's rights, she was harshly ridiculed. But she was committed to what she knew was a just cause. And you know what? She celebrated her 80th birthday at the White House. And 100 years ago, the 19th Amendment became the law of the land. A handful of years later, it became the law in Bangladesh, or what was then colonial India. So we have some twinning processes going on there, I think. But I think there are some real lessons from this struggle for us today, a lesson about perseverance, because we all know perseverance is needed. Women's suffrage is sometimes portrayed as a triumphant end to a movement, the hard-won reward for decades of struggle. But we all know things didn't end there. They haven't ended yet. But there was more work to do. In fact, it wasn't until 1965 that the Voting Rights Act was passed, and this banned racial discrimination with respect to voting. It was outlawed. That had to change, right? America is still changing, still trying to improve, and it's so important that we continue to affirm our founding principles, that all are created equal, all are entitled to life, liberty, happiness. It's up to us now to redouble these efforts to build a world that rejects things like racism, that protects human dignity of men and women. It guarantees human rights for every person. And as has been demonstrated in my own country this year, that work remains incomplete. But still, after the 19th Amendment was passed, women began seeking public office. And as a result, we saw local public health care spending increase. We saw child mortality decline. We saw more spendings on social programs and charities. And female voting also led to higher education budgets, and that caused children to stay in school, and that helped spur economic growth. Right now in the US, we have 131 women in the US Congress, and that's a record for us. But, you know, there's good news and bad news. It's a record, but it is only a quarter of our Congress. The United States has only once had a major party female nominee for president, and last week in the US, for only the third time in our entire history, a woman was nominated to be vice president by a major political party. And what's more noteworthy, and I'm sure you all are aware of this, she's the first woman of color and the first woman of South Asian heritage nominated for such a position. Frankly, we could all take a few lessons from South Asia, where strong women have led important nations for decades, including right here in Bangladesh. In every country, women and girls continue to experience challenges limiting their full and meaningful participation in society. But as we all know, societies that fail to treat women as equal, that fail to respect their human rights, that prevent them from reaching their full potential, these countries suffer. One study estimates that closing the gender entrepreneur gap worldwide would grow global GDP by as much as 2%. So if you're not persuaded to fully embrace entire equality for all for reasons that it's the right thing to do, perhaps the economic reasons will be persuasive. We still have much work to do. All of us, women and men, have to think about and recognize perhaps our own unconscious biases, our own unconscious prejudices, and then work to overcome them. We have to embrace groundbreaking folks who have pushed forward in the recognition of human rights, including women's rights. For example, Sayeeda Khanum, Bangladesh's very first female professional photographer. We mourn her recent passing, but we celebrate her iconic photographs of women freedom fighters and other liberation war milestones that she captured, and that which in turn captured the resilience and courage of the Bangladeshi people, and a remarkable legacy in this own country. So In closing, let's encourage your spouses, your sisters, your co-workers, your children, sons and daughters, to pursue their interest, to be supportive of all rights, to stand up, to speak up when you see or hear about discrimination or harassment in any form, because frankly, it's not okay. It's not okay anytime, anywhere, anymore, if it ever was in the first place. And as a former First Lady, whom I really admire, and one of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, said, "You must do the things you think you cannot do." It's very hard, but it's so very necessary, and it's the lesson I think we get from all of these groundbreaking women who pursued what they knew was right. Courageous women simply inspire a better world, and I'm so very proud to be among so many courageous women and men today. I can't wait to see what you will do tomorrow. So, onak donobad, apnader shonta opowok korun. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those inspiring words. Next, I'd like to invite another member of the U.S. Embassy community, Staff Sergeant Emma Garrett of the United States Air Force, to say a few words about her experiences as a young voter in the United States. Staff Sergeant Garrett.
Okay, so thank you to Deputy Chief of Mission Wagner for the opportunity to allow me to say a few words today. So hello, I am Staff Sergeant Emma Garrett, and I am in the United States Air Force. So I have just arrived to Bangladesh from Florida, and I'm really happy to be in such a beautiful country. So wearing this uniform I have on today, I have taken an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, which includes the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing the right for women to vote. Many women have come before me to fight for this right to vote. Women today are able to have their voices heard by participating in voting. Growing up, I admired this very right to have my own voice heard by voting. When I turned 18, it was a presidential election year, and on the ballot was the first African American running for president. I was honored to be able to take part in such a historical event through voting. Thank you, and Dhanabad.
Thank you very much, Staff Sergeant. Next, I'd like to invite our moderator for this afternoon's panel, Advocate Rukhsana Khondekar, to introduce our panel and begin our broad discussion. Rukhsana is a great friend and advocate for women and political development. You have all worked with her at many times. She's trained more than 20,000 women in political development, including many current members of Parliament. She has trained and advocated and founded countless organizations. We are thrilled to have her with us. Rukhsana, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you indeed, Josh, for very kindly inviting me to moderate this virtual session organized by the US Embassy. Needless to say, this very special event has been organized to celebrate 100 years of women's suffrage in the United States of America and discuss the role of women in political decision-making, a turning point in the history of the United States as a sequel to what is often referred to as the unfinished work of the 19th Amendment. I am indeed honored. Today, we'll also bring forth the role of women as voters and the roles in political decision-making. In Bangladesh, since well before our independence, women have been enjoying voters' rights as well as political rights in this country. Yet a lot remains to be achieved until this day. As a matter of fact, even after 50 years of independence, it is necessary to discuss what role the women are really able to play in this country. I believe today's speakers will also highlight the aspects in their presentations. Today we have with us three knowledgeable and very successful panel speakers. As participants, we also have women leaders from grassroots to national level, NGO representatives, and women rights activists. However, the question remains how much real power we, the women, can indeed exercise in our policy planning and decision making, in spite of the fact that we have women placed in the highest position in this country. Today, our first panelist, Ambassador Nasim Firdaus. As a career diplomat, she had gathered long experience in global affairs. She is also the president of Bangladesh Alliance of Women Political Leaders. Now, Ambassador Firdaus, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thank you for inviting me to this very august gathering of people I know from a long time and have worked with, as you have put it rightly. Let me begin by congratulating the American women on their 100th anniversary of the women's suffrage. As the DCM mentioned, that this right has always been there. I mean, it's a God-given right, although written in Constitution at different times by different strong people. But at the end of the day, the Constitution is really a piece of paper, and that can be destroyed and mutilated and done away with in countries, and we have seen it all over the world. So it is up to the women to continue their vigilance in terms of keeping their voting rights alive and well. I also would like to congratulate the American women and on their nomination of a woman of color as a new vice presidential candidate, and we wish her well. We look forward, Bangladeshis look forward, and the rest of the world indeed looks forward to the U.S. leadership in democracy and leadership in establishing women's rights. And we hope that this is going to happen. As you mentioned, as the DCM mentioned, there's only a quarter of the seats in the Congress occupied by women. So we hope that the US will lead here and enhance the number of women in the House of Representatives, as well as the Senate, which is up for elections again. And we wish you all the best. In Bangladesh, we would also like to see greater numbers of women in leadership positions, especially in decision making. Not just one woman in a board of, and across all spectrums. I mean, across the spectrum in all organizations, starting from the political leadership to the leadership in businesses and entrepreneurs, in enterprises and big banks, etc., etc. And not just one woman in a board of 10 members, 300 seats, but there should be a more proportional representation of the population, because these people, the numbers make a difference. And when there are a greater number of women in the parliament or in decision-making bodies, they actually carry our hopes, our aspirations, our thoughts, and our feelings to the decision-making place where decisions are taken for women. On behalf of the women, but not not taking into account their views and their thoughts. Now, what is the best weapon available to the women to change these issues, these decisions, or make a difference, basically, in leadership and make a difference in decision making? The best weapon is, of course, voting. The right to vote, the freedom to choose their representatives is the best weapon. And Bangladesh, as was noted earlier, as a part of undivided India, actually got its voting rights enfranchised in the Calcutta mayoral election in 1923. And since then, it's nearly 100 years, and it's since then women have been voting. In fact, my mother was this is a story from my mother, which I've heard over and over, that she was very proud to have voted for a mayor of Calcutta in 1933. Subsequently, she played an active role in one decision that made a difference in the Bangladesh's history. And I'll just quote that story because I think it's very important for us to know. When the British Raj left this part of the world, they left 3 areas hanging for decisions, and they said that the people of those areas will decide which country, whether India or Pakistan, they will join. And these 3 areas included Kashmir, which is well known, the Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan, which is also well known, and Sylhet. And Sylhet eventually became Bangladesh, but the process was long, and the process included something that we should all know. Women of Sylhet, the Muslim League, at that time there was only one party, and that was the Muslim League, and the Muslim League women actually campaigned from door to get the women's vote out. And that influenced the decision for Sylhet to join. Instead of joining Assam and going to India, they joined Sylhet. So this was a process which actually, where women played a very significant role in getting this country, in this region into Bangladesh. It's a fundamental choice, a fundamental right to choose, and a fundamental choice of women of who they should select and how they should select. In December 2018, or between September and December 2018, the Election Commission actually held an awareness-raising series of activities, and let me look into this particular framework that they used. Awareness-raising series of activities for women across a token of 10 districts, where they actually promoted the idea that women should be voting and in very safe and secure situation, because that is one of the major problems in Bangladesh, getting women to not only to vote, because the voting pattern shows that from 1947 in the Sylhet referendum, starting from there, if I start from there, then in the elections where Hussein Sheikh Sarwardi became the Prime Minister of Pakistan, where then in 1971, women have continuously voted in big numbers. And they have indeed made a difference. And they have been seen in long queues voting for whatever side they wanted to take. So these voting patterns have actually helped the political process in Bangladesh. This having been said, the problem with women in voting and women becoming candidates is that the fear of violence is a very big fear, and still continues to be so. In 2018, when the Election Commission had this series of awareness-raising programs in these districts, in these 8 divisions, the stakeholders, primarily the women at every level, from the grassroots to the political women who have been voted in the parliament, everyone mentioned 2 things. And one was the level of education of women. Because their level of education and training, and I put emphasis on training, lack of training on political issues or understanding of the political spectrum has somehow determined whether women in Bangladesh will be actually taking part in the political process. So despite having such a huge number of women in this country, almost 50-50 in terms of the ratio between men and women, we still have so few women contesting. We may have long queues of voters, but we still have very few women contesting. 2008 elections was perhaps a watershed, where 88 women sought nomination, 50 of them or 55 of them got the nomination, and only 20 were elected directly. Adding on to these elected women is, in terms of reserve seats, is a way to increase numbers, but that does not actually compensate for the numbers in the decision-making process. They don't have the weight that an elected member of parliament would have. So those things we need to change, and we need to change. The focus was focus of by the stakeholders in this series of activities was that women need to have their family members change their attitude, but women themselves need to change their attitude. And they looked forward to role models. And they talked about role models who would mentor them. We don't have that in Bangladesh. We don't have mentoring among political leaders, women political leadership, and that has to be established in a sense. I don't know how, perhaps by introducing schemes of scholarships or attachments or mentorship programs in larger number for women to get into the political process. That is how it will be encouraged. They will be encouraged. But going back to this education and training, they also mentioned that the education and training level of men in rural areas affects women's participation in the political process. And that is because men think they know better, and so they dictate what the women can do. But the women in Bangladesh have to understand that the voting right is their absolute right. And since it's done in secret, they don't have to disclose to anybody who they voted for. And that strength has to come from within, build up their confidence level to make them comfortable in this process. Finally, there's one more thing that the Election Commission did at that time was hold a series of a sort of a play, a drama. And this was appreciated by all because it made it very clear as to how men and women have to behave during voting process, and also how men should behave in terms of allowing the women to participate in the process. And the suggestion was that this drama should be widely publicized, should be put on stage across the country, etc., etc. And there is no concerted effort to do that in this country. Even the Election Commission does not have the means to do that kind of a wide-scale 64 district, 500 upazilas to hold this series of dramas to raise the awareness of women's participation in Bangladesh. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Firdaus, for your presentation. Ambassador Firdaus has given the scenario of Bangladesh women's voting pattern, how they involved in political position. And she also rightly mentioned that women's voters turnout in our country is very high. But at the same time, in the decision-making process, they don't have that much ensure. They cannot do that much position in the decision-making process. Again, thank you to Ambassador Firdaus. Now, I would like to go to our second panelist, Advocate Sarah Hussain, Executive Director of Bangladesh Legal Aid, Honorary Executive Director of Bangladesh Legal Aid, Bangladesh Legal Aid, and Bangladesh Legal Aid and Trust, BLAST, and she is a renowned lawyer of the Bangladesh Supreme Court. She always fights for disadvantaged and marginalized group in this country. Advocate Sarah Hussain is also a human rights activist in this country. So now I would like to request Advocate Sarah Hussain to speak about the issues.
Thank you so much, Roxana. And many thanks to the Embassy for arranging this discussion and for marking this important anniversary for us. Perhaps I could just begin by referring to a couple of the comments, or I think the framing from the Deputy Chief of Mission and also from Ambassador Naseem. I think what the Deputy Chief mentioned about the importance of this centenary and the relevance of the actions of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others of actually not being afraid to engage in controversy and not expecting rights to be enforced just somehow from on high, but realizing that you have to make the demands, and you have to make the demands in the face of considerable opposition, is a very useful reminder for us about how rights actually do become real in our lives. Certainly, I fully agree with her that it's not a question of being given the rights, but it is very much a question of demanding them and seizing them and enforcing them. And equally, I think Ambassador Nasim's reminder to us about the whole process of decolonization and how women in the subcontinent in South Asia, again, fought for their rights and fought for their space, really locates for us where we should be starting our conversation from. And of course, we've also moved a long way in that certainly when Bangladesh started its own journey in 1971 and with our constitution in 1972, we didn't have to reinvent the wheel around women's suffrage or around universal suffrage. That was very much a given. But what we have had to do, as women around the world continue to have to do, is still fight out the issues, not only actually around the right to enforce that, and we have very real challenges in Bangladesh in terms of the right to vote and participation in elections, which remind us that this entire process of fighting for our rights is not a linear struggle. We don't just keep on building and getting more positives. We also regress, we also move backwards. And this is a moment in the world and in Bangladesh where we face many confrontations, many challenges, many questions about whether there is a right to participatory elections, whether there is a right for all parties, to be fully engaged in the political process. And in fact, where there isn't the same political space for everybody of different views. So I think we have to acknowledge that it's a challenging framework that we have in front of us now. Another issue, and again, the Deputy Chief of Mission mentioned this exciting development in America at the moment with the nomination of a vice presidential candidate who's a woman, one of very few in America's history, but also a woman from not just one, but two major minority groups, and of course also from our subcontinent. I should also mention she's also a lawyer, which is exciting lots of us from the legal profession as well, in terms of, just her having that position at the moment. I think in terms of Bangladesh's history, some of the things that are interesting for us to look at is, in terms of our constitution framing, the women representatives, we did have many women representatives in our Constituent Assembly. And some of them were women who had, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, fought for women's rights even before we had our own parliament. So women like Nur Jahan Murshid, for example, or Badrunnisa Ahmed, who were founders of women's organizations in their own right before they became members of parliament, but who then went on into the Constituent Assembly and were part of the process of framing our constitutional guarantees around equal rights and also around special measures, around reservations, quotas, and other kinds of means for advancing women's rights. In the almost 50 years since, we've also seen that there's been a continuous interest, a continuous concern about how we increase women's representation in parliament as a structure, as a particular institution of democracy. And the same constitutional amendment the constitutional provision that we had initially in 1972 was brought in again later on, was renewed and refreshed, this provision for having reserved seats for women. But in one of the more recent developments for refreshing that or renewing that provision, it was interesting to see that women's organizations in Bangladesh, right across the political spectrum, united to say that we no longer wanted women to go into parliament simply in reservations where they were nominated by the political parties concerned, by the majority political party, or in proportion to the political parties. And all women's organizations said they actually wanted to see women's representation in these reserved seats to reflect the accountability of those women to women as a whole, to the women in the electorate. And so actually women's organizations challenged that constitutional provision, saying that they wanted these accountability measures to be built in so that women would have to be directly elected by women and not by their political parties. Unfortunately, that challenge failed, and our Supreme Court didn't accept that, and we still have this provision that women are elected from their political parties and are not directly accountable to the electorate. And I think that means that we have a lot of challenges in terms of whether women in parliament actually raise women's issues or raise issues around gender equality or not. We've seen many actually male politicians who've played a very dynamic role in that respect and have taken up issues. For example, one of the current members of parliament, Mr. Sabir Hussain Chaudhry, had played a very useful role, has been playing a very useful role in trying to advance certain issues around ensuring equality in terms of the laws around gender-based violence and the laws around rape, which are still highly gender discriminatory. So I think we need to be aware that while we want to have women in public spaces and political spaces, women need to represent women's interests, and those women need to speak up for gender equality. It's not enough to have women there, and that we also need to have alliances. This, I think, another quick point, I think, is where to note how far we've moved in Bangladesh as well. That initially, in the period that Ambassador Naseem was speaking about, in the colonial period, initially, of course, women's suffrage, like all issues of suffrage, was focused around property rights and literacy, for example. So it was very class-based. And now, of course, we've moved to universal suffrage. But at the same time, one of the things we see now is that the question of representation by community is very relevant. So while we may see many women from Muslim Bengali backgrounds in our parliament, we don't see as many women from minority religious communities. We certainly don't see very many women from different ethnicities. We don't see women from the community of people with disabilities. And I think importantly, as we recognize that all of the changes that we've seen in the 20th century around the whole notion of gender as well, it's time for us to think about how we have representations from trans women, from the Hijra community, which is a small but significant section of our population as well. So I think we have real opportunities to look at how we build on the advances we've had as women in political space, but how we strengthen and consolidate those voices and how we diversify those voices as well. And I think in this context, maybe the very final point might be that it would be important for us also to look at, exactly as we're doing today, how do we ensure that in political space, just as we in civil society talk about having greater space for women politicians and greater voice for women politicians amongst all politicians, that we also build some kind of process of having interaction between women and civil society and women politicians to speak about issues of gender equality, and that we talk about substantive issues. So not just the symbolism of having women in these different spaces, whether in our space of civil society or in political space, but actually looking at structural inequality. How do we change the situation so that women in political space are not held back, just like all other women, by care duties, responsibilities in the home, not having any kind of structural support for looking after children, looking after other family members, dealing with their household issues? And how do we have protection and security in our individual lives? So we're not, I think one of the chat box questions, I think from a journalist, is how do we deal with questions of, for example, sexual harassment, a very live issue right around the world today. So I think we have lots of these questions in front of us to fight together. We have to look at the fact we've got to move ahead, and we've got to challenge the kind of regressive voices, extremist voices, fundamentalist voices from whatever religion they come from that are holding back the process of gender equality. In this moment of thinking back to 100 years ago and how American women won the right to suffrage is a great reminder for us in South Asia and in Bangladesh of also how much we've achieved, but how much we still have to do. So thank you very much again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Sarah. You definitely spoke as human rights activists. Really, you raised very important issues about the women's rights, the whole scenario of Bangladesh women in parliament, how they involved in the parliament. You mentioned about Mrs. Nurjahan Murshid and all these women, how they involved in the parliament. So I'm sure that in our question answer period that you can explain some more about these issues. And you also raised some issues about the Hijra community and their voting rights. And you have done a lot of work for this. So thank you, Sarah, again for your presentation. Now I would like to go to our third panelist, Ms. Dawn Scheffel, Deputy Political Counselor in the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka. She is not only has vast experience in American diplomacy, but is also an expert in European affairs and global security issues. Having been in NATO before coming to Bangladesh, she will focus on women's role as voters and how they can experience their lives. Please, Dawn Scheffel, please come and speak about give your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roxana. I'm delighted to join two very powerful advocates in Roxana and Sarah on this panel, as well as a very strong voice in an ambassador, Nazim. And I'm honored also to follow one of my bosses, the Deputy Chief of Mission, Joanne Wagner. This is a really important and relevant issue worldwide, even more and beyond the anniversary year. But the fact that a number of these issues are tied into a very large global conversation that's happening around the world. So I'm delighted to join everyone, and I look forward to the question and answer period as well. On the topic at hand, let me throw a few things out for consideration, and we can add to the discussion. I wanted to offer a few fun facts coming back from the original adoption of the 19th Amendment. The language itself, interestingly, doesn't actually mention the right to vote for women. It says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, which I thought was kind of interesting. Also, this fight, as the DCM mentioned, took a long, long time. And it's a good reminder to all of us that these changes don't happen overnight, but that we may need decades and decades to fight the fight. Because in fact, at that moment in time, there was about half as many women on each side of this argument. Many of them felt that to be a true woman was to be at home and to be part of their family, their focus on their husband, and their husband would represent their rights, as our other panelists have said. While the other half were out fighting the good fight to create this space for equality. But voting was only one of the issues they were focused on. At the Seneca Falls Convention, there were actually 12 different resolutions, and the most controversial and not the highest priority was actually the right to vote. They were focused at that time on things like education and healthcare, and importantly, on the right to own property and be able to inherit property. Some of these issues we still grapple with today. So it's very interesting sort of keeping that in mind in context, but then also as you go through to the actual vote in the US Congress, showing the influence of women in very different ways, the deciding factor was, or the deciding vote was actually cast. It was one vote difference. A member from our U.S. state of Tennessee, a male, his name was Representative Harry T. Byrne, had a letter in his pocket from his mother who said, "Please be a good boy and give me the right to vote." He was going to vote against, and thanks to the letter, he voted for the resolution or the amendment. And so it's interesting how even a voice from your mom can all of a sudden be a deciding factor in a much, much larger issue. And it's also important to note on the anniversary that, in fact, a number of other countries had beat us to it. Countries that we see continue to lead in women, peace and security and women's issues, even today, like New Zealand, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. They continue to have prominent female leaders who are continuing to push the envelope of what can be done in the global political sphere. So now, noting that we have important elections in front of us, some here smaller elections coming up in Bangladesh, but a big one in the United States. The most important thing about this right to vote is, in fact, being able to actually have a voice, to be able to stand up for the things you care about and that matter to you as an individual. So that means a whole range of issues that are good for women, but might actually be good just for you. Things like racial inequality that we're talking about on a global scale right now. Things like education and healthcare, but also economic issues, financial issues, healthcare for your parents or your family members. All of these things are tied up into a specific right to vote and be able to carry out those views to a larger audience and hopefully make a change in the global or the government context and in your particular country. So I have been lucky enough in my career to work for a number of very prominent women in my life as a U.S. public servant. I actually worked for the very first female Secretary of Energy, a woman by the name of Hazel O'Leary. And she's actually quite famous for a number of different things, but the things that both interesting and more, shall we say, controversial. But what I think is important at her legacy at the Department of Energy at the time is symbolic of the kind of qualities you see in women's leaders is a couple of things. And let me list off the 4 things that she was really known for. She successfully lobbied for a comprehensive test ban on nuclear weapons in the United States, which for us was a very big deal back in the 1990s. She worked very hard to reduce the movement of nuclear weapons materials, particularly in the former Soviet Union, and getting those out and to places where they could be protected. She also was very responsible for a whole range of radioactive cleanup issues in the United States. And lastly, and I think this is most important and maybe most reflective of female leadership, is she was really committed to gaining the public trust and confidence. And how she did that was by declassifying an enormous amount of documents from the history of the Department of Energy, some quite controversial, but needed to clear the air on a number of long simmering issues with the department to be able to gain the public trust to, again, take on these other very, very challenging issues. Similarly, I've been lucky enough to work for several other cabinet secretaries more recently, including Susan Rice when she was our ambassador to the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, and then Samantha Power after her, because they were both cabinet level positions at the time. And I think what's interesting about working for all of these very prominent women is they bring a number of skills and talents probably to an organization, to a political structure and decision making, and this comes across, whether you're an elected or an appointed official, that changes the conversation. Certainly at the UN Security Council, when I was there in New York, we had 5 out of 15 representatives that were female. They sat around the table and they changed the conversation. It's been many studies have been had, but things like they show greater empathy. They're good listeners. They tend to be more nurturing. They're also very focused on the teamwork and can set their egos aside much more easily. They're good at multitasking, which I suspect many of you can say right now as you're watching this and doing other things at the same time. They tend to be very strong communicators, and I think we see this in a number of leaders in the world today, especially ones that are tackling some of the big global challenges like COVID right now. Female leaders are making a difference in ways that others may not be. They tend to dream big and are not really afraid, because I think that comes from all of us being women growing up in a space where we have to fight for space, to have a conversation, to make our voice heard at the table and not have somebody else take credit for it. By doing this your whole life, you get better and better at it. Lastly, I would say they tend to have a high emotional intelligence, so really can process information, sense what's happening, and look for very creative solutions, even in times of very big crisis, which again, we can see in a number of countries around the world today. So that's why I think it's important that we can look at these skills and talents and continue to cultivate opportunities for women to grow into these spaces. And that doesn't matter whether it's the military, in the civil service, elected politicians, in political parties, in civil society, and frankly, in your community. There's an opportunity all the way around the world for women to make a difference. And I think we see it in Bangladesh, particularly on a local level, where women are the ones that are driving the activity at the very, very local level. So I think there's enormous opportunity to talk about how we continue to advance these issues and tackle them head on, but also, most importantly, as a couple of our panelists have said, support one another as we do so. There's strength in numbers. We're more powerful, and the 19th Amendment would have never come to be had we not had really strong support amongst one another, but then also support from those around us, including very prominent men who understand and are not threatened by the role of women, but in fact, actually, are empowered by that. And that is probably one of the most powerful things we can do going forward. So with that, I will turn it back to the moderator to open up the floor for questions, and I look forward to having a conversation with everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Dawn, for your nice presentation. And you also mentioned about your experience with political leaders, women political leaders. It's very nice to hear all this information from you. So now I would like to ask Josh for getting the question, and then our panelists can answer all these questions. Josh, can you hear me?
Thank you, Roxana. Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. So I've harvested questions from the chat box, and I'll do my best to represent them well and to combine questions which seem thematic. The first question from Charmin Nagorik. Even after 100 years, we see that sexual harassment against women has not decreased. Global sexual harassment seems to increase or is a top issue in developed countries. Is the issue of women's security and discrimination more or less important than voter participation? I can add a few others. How do we expect or how do we encourage women to be active in politics and participate in an election when so frequently women may face violence or psychological violence attempting to persuade or dissuade voter participation? Including the US in this conversation, beyond basic suffrage, we see in the media comments related to a major party vice presidential candidate. We see comments about race toward a political candidate. What does that say about opinions and attitudes toward women and minorities? Let's start there, and then we'll follow up with additional questions related to Parliament and reserve seats.
Ambassador Nasim Firdaus like to answer this question.
Well, I would like to answer the question about the security issue, because this is one of the points that was repeatedly raised during the Election Commission awareness campaign in 2018. And interestingly, it was not only the women who were raising the security issue, but also the men being concerned about their spouses or daughters or whoever going out to vote, and not only about voting, but about candidatures. They were more concerned about women candidates being harassed, and the most immediate was harassment. It was not about sexual harassment only, but harassment in all kinds and all types, and this was an issue raised. This not only affects the voters or candidates, but also interestingly, the security givers, the female police officers, they too raise this question. So it's a very broad spectrum of security issues that comes with elections and with the political process. They themselves answered it this way. I mean, those who were in positions of power, who were speakers or stakeholders in this conversation, answered it this way. They said that we have to raise the level of education and understanding of men to change their attitudes toward women. So education played a very important role in the discussion, and in most places this was very similar, coined in different ways. But most importantly, it was in Sylhet that the women were very concerned about their education. And they said that they were not allowed to go forward in politics because they had a lack of understanding of the process. And the level of education was low, especially in remote areas with Upazila vice chairs or members, commissioners. They were concerned about this more than anyone else. But the men also were concerned about this, that the women were not educated enough to be able to participate in political issues. And they said that our women don't understand politics. That was the common phrase used by most men throughout this, in the 10 districts that we went to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Firdaus. Sarah, Advocate Sarah, would you like to answer this question?
Sure, yeah. So I think those are pertinent questions that, how do women deal with intimidation and harassment? And I completely agree with Ambassador Naseem. I think it's not just about sexual harassment. Women may face particularly, misogynist attacks and so on, but actually there's just a lot of physical harassment and intimidation that goes on in elections with candidates, but also with voters. And also particularly with minority voters. We've had terrible incidents of attacks on minority women in different elections, in the last one and then some of the previous ones in the early 2000s as well. And I think that in that case, we need a lot. This is because of the way in which I am talking about our context in Bangladesh, not so much about the US, but it's also to do with the fact we need to discuss not bigger, but other questions about the structures of politics and whether we have, an environment in which we actually can have real fair elections. We have laws about elections, we have an election commission, but we can't often safely participate in these processes. And safety is certainly the physical intimidation is a big part of it, but actually the use of our law and the abuse of our law to harass people is a really important thing for us to look at in the Bangladesh context. So we've just seen regularly in all of our elections under whatever administration, that the ruling party in power, it happens to be Awami League today, it was BNP yesterday, whoever it is, tends to use the law to actually go after opposition candidates and threaten them with all manner of things. Generally, women don't get accused of rape, but they do get accused of other things, and male candidates get accused of everything starting, honestly, absurdly, from rape to murder to what have you. So I think that issue around the way in which harassment and intimidation affect our elections is probably a little bit different in our context to the US context. But coming back to the sexual harassment issue, clearly a lot needs to be done in terms of not only positive measures like education and assuming that it's just lack of awareness that makes people harass is a charitable way to look at it. But I think that maybe it's more than that. And so you also have to have, in addition to, awareness, encouragement, information, you do have to have sanctions. You do have to have people pulling up and taking action against their own political party members or supporters who are involved in these acts of harassment. We need to see the kind of impunity for this, which isn't limited to political parties, being addressed through our legal process. And we need to see that actually women can operate safely in public spaces. I think one point to mention here maybe is also, again, and again, this is a global thing, we also see cyber harassment as a huge issue these days. So for candidates and for voters, fake news, cyber harassment, all of these are kind of muddying and complicating the environment we're operating in. So just as we're having to be very vigilant about trying to ensure, as Ambassador Naseem said, security in physical space, it's also, and this is a very challenging battle for the whole world right now, is how do we have security in cyberspace? And particularly for women, we've seen incredibly ugly attacks, to do with women's sexuality, character attacks on them, threats to them. So that definitely has to be tackled. At the same time, I think for politicians in particular, politicians being, and particularly elected persons, have to recognize that they are public persons. And so they have to be open to having criticism. No one should accept misogynist attacks. No one should accept harassment. I'm not saying that. But politicians have to accept constructive criticism, even satirical comments, cartoons about themselves, which they might not like too much, and they shouldn't be throwing people into jail when those things happen. So I think that we should, and they shouldn't be threatening them, with the law and with police showing up in their homes in the middle of the night. So those are some things that we unfortunately have to think about quite a bit in Bangladesh as well.
Is that okay to make just a couple of comments? Well, I really, really appreciate comments that have been made in answer to these three questions. Just add to some of the things that were said that I thought were absolutely spot on. Something that Sarah Hossain said a little bit earlier today was that the struggle is not a linear one. So when I don't think it's the right juxtaposition to compare, is the right to vote more important than dealing with sexual harassment harassment. These things come together, and we have to keep plowing ahead with education, with illustrating to our young people that this is not acceptable, and having consequences for some of those who continued harassing and beyond. For example, we've seen in the United States there are prosecutions for some rather prominent people for continued sexual harassment and all the way into rape, the Harvey Weinsteins, for example, of the world. And that's a good thing, but it takes its real toll on the people who've been the victims. So giving that support, I think, is very, very important as well. The comments about race, et cetera, and the ugliness that is attendant to for example, the Democratic candidate for vice president is an ugliness that is being exposed. Unfortunately, some people feel threatened by different groups coming to power, coming to influence, etc. And those kinds of things continue. They're not acceptable. They're absolutely not acceptable at any time. And we're going to have to continue the fight to push back against that. And not only the overt expressions, but also examining our own unconscious biases. You know, where am I making assumptions? Where am I drawing conclusions without really examining what my motivations are, what my conclusions are based upon? And I think that's a struggle, that's a battle that we're going to have to continue to fight for a while. But I do want to say that my nephews, for example, have much better attitudes towards many of these things than, for example, my uncles or grandfathers did. So there's an evolution. I don't think we can sit down and say, well, it evolved so we can rest. We have to keep pushing. But I am hopeful that despite the ugliness that comes out, we can. And then one other thing I wanted to pick up on is how do we encourage women to participate? There is a wonderful NGO, it's a small NGO in the United States called Running Start. And this is an NGO that was started by a woman who asked the question, why aren't more women running for political office? And she started doing some research, and she found that some of it started very young, that young women, it never occurred to them that they could run for office, that they had the stuff that was necessary to run, that was an avenue open to them. And she started a group where she set up young women in leadership groups to examine what kinds of skills do you need to be able to run for office? And by the way, what does that mean anyway? And what does a legislator, what does a politician do? How do you build confidence so a woman will step out and say, yeah, I can do this, and I'm going to do this. I'm ready to step out. And she paired these young women with people who could be mentors. In most cases, they were women in politics, and nonpartisan, doesn't matter. But pair these young women up with mentors who can tell them the straight scoop. Give them leadership skills, give them public speaking skills, help them know how to address an audience. How does a bill go from idea to law? And they've had great success over, I'm trying to think how many years they have been in existence. But they have started chapters in other countries as well. And I think it's a kind of model that might be interesting for folks here in Bangladesh to examine. Thank you.
Now, Dawn, would you like to answer the question?
Well, let me just add one thing, because I think this is one of the most striking elements that I've learned about Bangladesh politics since arriving last fall. Is it's rare to meet a political elected official that doesn't have a huge number of legal cases that have been filed against them. It doesn't matter which party. And many of them have experienced, male or female, violence and harassment. And I found that quite stunning. And I guess I should not have been surprised, but I was. And I think one of the things we need to look at is, because this is both men and women, it actually is even more powerful argument. I recall, many of you know, our famous Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Part of the way that she managed to make as much progress in US law in creating equality between men and women was actually fighting for men's rights. often she was fighting for the spousal rights of someone, for instance, in the US military. That spouse, who happened to be a man, needed some additional rights to make them equitable. And that's how she managed to get more rights for women at the same time. So we need to be looking at creative ways that we can create space for safety and security for these political folks that are courageous enough to run for office, but also then create by extension space for average citizens like you and me to be able to go and vote. And that is a call that's got to come from the people and from those that are running. It is a responsibility certainly of the government to create that space to make it happen, but our voices are what help catalyze all of that. And we all should not be afraid to speak out on those issues. Over.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Dawn. Josh, we are almost at the end of our program. So do you think we'll take some more questions?
I would like to package up this final cohort of questions. It will give everyone something to say.
Sure.
But yes, we are coming toward the end of our time.
Okay.
Many questions about Parliament and reserved seats. Reserved seats have existed in Parliament. It was extended for the next 25 years. Isn't this contrary to many articles of the Constitution? Similarly, 33% of women are supposed to have reserved seats in every political party, but that has been canceled. What do you think? Is there any system of reserved seats for women in the United States? Is it possible to achieve equal rights of gender within politics when a reserved seat system exists? Transitioning from Parliament to future. I run a girls' youth club. We work on science and technology and public speaking and entrepreneurship. What can we do for our girls' club to build political awareness among young women? And can representatives like you set an example to create programs on leadership in schools, colleges, or apprenticeship for young women to learn about decision making? Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Advocate Sarah Hussain or Ambassador Nasim Firdaus, would you like to answer this question? Advocate Sarah Hussain or Ambassador Nasim Firdaus?
I think I'll let Sarah speak out first, and then I can talk on the leadership question.
Sure, but I'll just talk about the constitutional amendment, I mean the reserved seat part. So as I mentioned earlier, the reserved seats in Parliament are there by way of a constitutional amendment. But what's important to remember is it was always meant to be a temporary measure. So the Constitution, and it doesn't contradict other constitutional measures on equality, and I'll explain why. So we have a guarantee on in the Constitution saying there shall be equal rights between men and women in public life. We also have a guarantee saying there are prohibitions saying there'll be no discrimination on the grounds of race, religion, sex, place of birth, caste also. But then we have another provision which says that the state shall take special measures. It's an absolute duty on the state. It's not something they can duck out of. The state has to take special measures for the advancement of women. So there is a carving out, there is a process for having these reservations, positive discrimination, if you like, or affirmative action through which the reserved seats for women in Parliament have come about. And they have to be renewed periodically, so I think every 15 years or something. I think at this point, as I said earlier, I don't think we should have the reserve seats in the format we have them. I don't think we should have a political party just nominating a certain number of women that it wants. I think there should be direct accountability to the electorate, but we are going to have either, again, another challenge, which is not very likely, I think, to succeed, given it's been challenged before the Supreme Court and failed, or we have to have a new constitutional amendment on that, allowing women to be in reserve seats, but directly from the electorate. I think at this point it's very improbable, because I think the women in those reserve seats are not likely to want to give up their position. And we don't have that much political space to actually debate these things, but I think that's what should happen. And as far as local government is concerned, I think it's important to see the difference, because in local government, the women in reserve seats are actually elected. And they actually have to fight much tougher elections. They have to fight elections from 3 different constituencies as opposed to 1 constituency, which is what people in general seats have to do. So they tend to have more connection to their constituencies. We did a case many years ago for women who were elected to a city corporation from reserve seats, who then came to raise a question before the Supreme Court, saying that once they had been elected to their reserve seats, they were being told that they should only deal with women's issues. So they should only deal with subjects to do with violence against women, for example. They shouldn't deal with any of the other supposedly tough stuff or supposedly more prestigious stuff. So they came to court to say, excuse me, now that we've been elected, we're on the same level as everybody else. You know, the reservation is just there, so the door will be open so we can get into the room. But once we're in the room, we're all supposed to have the same rights. And I remember the judge who was hearing that case said to us, so you women want to have your cake and eat it as well? We said, yeah, 100%, why not? You know, that what you're going to do, just holding a piece of cake if you don't eat it. So I think that argument is still being won. But I think for women in both reserve seats in local government and in parliament, as well as those who are directly elected, there's still really an issue that in general, we don't see women always in, with 1 or 2 significant exceptions, in the more significant offices or with greater powers. So that is an issue that still is very much a challenge in our country and elsewhere. I think over to Nasima.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I will pick up on your last issue about the space question. The women in Bangladesh are actually boxed in and put in glass boxes, in my view. They don't have ceilings to break, but they actually have glass walls to break, because they can be seen from outside, but they can't see the world outside. And that is the big problem here. Also about the discrimination question, the Constitution guarantees no discrimination, equal rights in some ways in public space, but there are so many subtle discrimination being carried out on an everyday basis in the public life. I'll just cite one example on which I've written many times and publicly, so I can speak out publicly on this. If you get an invitation from the President's house or for a national reception or whatever, there is a line there says no handbags allowed. This is a discrimination, because men don't leave their pockets behind. They carry the same things in the pocket that we carry in our purses or clutches or pocketbook, whatever you call it. And yet we are seen differently because it's a part of our outfit. It's a part of our outfit. And the pockets in men's outfit is the same. So this kind of subtle discrimination exists across the board everywhere in different ways. And that is what we have to fight against. This is about the discrimination part. About mentoring and leadership, I want to say that Bangladesh Alliance for Women Leadership, which I had as president, actually gives training to women for leadership positions and leadership work, in which all these skills are taught: speaking, public speaking, how the bill becomes a law, etc., etc. But it's very difficult to do it in schools. And we have tried to do it long distance. Like now we are doing this format. I've used this kind of a format in 2014, 15, and 16 to train women. But frankly speaking, women themselves are not ready to take up this kind of training. They don't understand the concept of leadership in the terms that we would like to train them in. They want to reach positions, many of them want to reach positions before they have the capacity to deal with stuff that they have to deal with to become leaders. Thank you.
I'd like to add something about reserved seat in parliament, because Sarah mentioned that right after our liberation, we have introduced this in constitution, because and it was temporary basis. And it was introduced because it was needed that women should be in parliament, but the situation was not that enabling environment for women in the parliament. So we have reserved seat. But after 50 years of our liberation, independence, the number is increased. But if you see the status of women in parliament, their voice is not that high. They cannot say independently. And at the same time, we have seen that it is actually, we have done a study. I can show you the study book that we can did a study on this, and we found that most of the MPs, they are one time was in the parliament. So that's why it's true that reserved seat is not encouraging women to come through direct election. So that but we also have the same situation in local government. In local government, we can see that women are coming through the direct election. But in reserved seat. That's why their challenge is much more higher in local government. But at the same time, we saw that the women who come through the direct election in local level, their constituency is 3 times higher than the general seat. But at the same time, they are also not getting equal rights, equal access to any activities in their local level. So that's why it's true that we have to rethink about reserved seat. Maybe it's in the parliament or it's in the local level. It's okay. Now, Dawn, would you like to, there's a question that, do you have reserved seat in US Parliament? Can you answer this question?
Yes, I can. So the U.S. Congress does not have reserve seats. We are all elected. And as the DCM mentioned, we are not nearly equitable. In my time in government, we've made some headway and certainly have some pretty prominent and powerful senators and members of Congress on the House of Representatives side, but we are nowhere near equal. But what I would say on the quota issue, if I can chime in, around the world, we're seeing a number of countries using the quota system, some more successfully than others. But I would pose the question to this group is, what are the ways, there's a lot of very amazing women on this call and men who are interested in these issues. How can we help those in reserve seats to learn how to do their jobs better, offer them support, offer them issues to champion, and help build them up so that they one day are interested potentially and prepared to run for an elected seat, but also to go ahead and move issues forward because they're lucky enough to have a reserve seat at least as a starting platform. The other thing I would ask, because I suspect Josh is going to wrap us up here soon, is I would ask 2 things of everyone on this call. 1, look around you and find somebody in your circle or in your work that you can mentor and pull up with you. It's a powerful thing for us to grab even just one person and help elevate them in the workplace, in the home place, in your community. And the other thing is that I would encourage you to send information along to the U.S. Embassy on ideas where we might be able to run a program, sort of like tonight, but maybe more on specific skill sets or specific groups, maybe one for young, high school students or university students that are interested in pursuing politics. And we're happy to consider those things because I think it would be a lot of fun, but it's also us giving back for the good fortune that we've had and be able to elevate women's issues in our own world, and then to take that to the next level in a political world here in Bangladesh. Over.
Thank you, Dawn. So Josh, what do you think? So is our question answer session is over?
Yes, I'm sorry. We started a few minutes late and we've exhausted our time for questions. We do have a moment for a closing comment. And I'd like to invite all participants, particularly those wearing purple or gold, to stay on. Once we finish the formal part of the program, I'll ask you at that time to turn on your cameras and we'll take a virtual group photo waving towards the camera. So Rukhsana, back to you to close out.
Okay, thank you, Josh. In conclusion, I'd like to emphasize that even for a country like the United States of America, which is perhaps the most developed and the richest country of the world, it has taken the US Congress and Senate nearly 2 centuries and a half since 1976 to attain only 101 seats out of 435 in the Congress and 26 out of 100 seats in the Senate for women. This reconfirms the fact that the struggle for women's rights had never been easy in the past and will neither be for the future. Let us vow on this solemn occasion of the centennial of women's suffrage in the US that we will not stop until we achieve equality of women in all spheres of life, not just in their political empowerment. Finally, I gratefully thank Mrs. Joan Wagner for allocating her time for today's evening. At the same time, my sincere thanks to the US Embassy for taking this initiative. My heartfelt thanks to panel speakers, Advocate Sarah Hussain, Ambassador Nassim Firdaus, and Don Scrapper. In their valuable presentation, I thank all the participants and also especially those who made the session lively by asking very useful questions. While I apologize for not being able to mention them individually by name in view of time constraints, my thanks once again to Josh, Jonathan, and the full team of technical experts who made things easy for us at this difficult time of coronavirus. Women power shall prevail. Thank you. So we are concluding today's virtual session, and I hope that we'll go forward and we can go achieve and go to our goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to, I'd like to invite anyone wearing gold or purple. If you have had your camera off, please turn your camera on. We're going to take a group photo together to celebrate this great occasion.
I am with purple and also with gold.
I have to say, I'm just amazed at the, at the outfits everywhere. So if you're on camera, please wave for me. Thank you. That's one photo. And now we'll do page 2. We've got a lot of people on the call. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. That's all for me. From the American Center, thank you all so much. Congratulations, and thank you for the hard work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you. It was terrific.
Yeah, we clap everyone. Thanks.
Exactly.